I'm Cody, and this is Time for History. Herodotus has been called the father of history. He wasn't the first person to ever write history, but he was one of the first major figures who really started the discipline. Herodotus lived from around 484 to 425 BCE. He was born in Asia Minor in a Greek colony that was subjected to Persian rule. For this reason, you can really see a bias in the favor of the Greeks over the Persians in a lot of the writings. In fact, he many times simply refers to the Persians as the barbarians. Herodotus traveled extensively and he read extensively. You can see in his writings the impacts of his travels as well as the influence of many of the writings that came before him, such as the writings of Homer. He wrote a book called the Histories, which is about the lead up to the war between the Greeks and the Persians and the war itself. Now, if you ever read this, and you totally should, I have to warn you, he has so many digressions. We've all had that teacher who would go off topic really easily in class. That is Herodotus. He goes off topic about absolutely everything. He starts a story and inevitably he will say, oh, now here's another story that comes off of this. And then eventually he circles back to the point. So even giving a summary of the histories is difficult. But I want to try to give sort of the basic storyline. And it's a wild story at times too. I guess the best place to start is the king of Sardis thought that his wife was beautiful. And he had a bodyguard named Gyges. And one day he was talking to Gyges about how beautiful his wife, the queen, was. And Gyges didn't seem adequately impressed. So the king told Gyges, you have to see her naked. And Gyges was like, whoa, I don't know that that's something I want to sign up to do. Is this some kind of trick to get me killed or something? And the king says, no, it's not a trick. As your king, I really want you to do this. And so the king set up this sort of plot where the queen would walk into the bedroom and she would always undress when she came into the bedroom. And Gyges would be hiding in a spot where she couldn't see him. And he would watch the queen as she undressed. And then when she laid down in the bed, he would sneak out without her seeing him. So that night, Gyges goes along with it because his king commanded it. And he does it. And everything goes as planned until it's time for him to leave. And the queen looks up and sees him as he's leaving. She's very unhappy about this, but she realizes that the king probably put him up to it. So the next day, she calls Gyges into her chamber, and she says, I saw you leave. I know what happened, and I'm going to give you two choices. Either, number one, you can murder the king and make yourself the king to punish him for what he did. Or number two, I will have you killed to punish you for what you did. Faced with these two choices, he wants to live. So he says that he will kill the king. And the queen is going to help him. So she helps him. She gives him the knife. He kills the king. He proclaims himself as the new king. The Oracle of Delphi agrees and proclaims Gyges the king as well. And everything's good, except that the followers of the previous king are not happy. And they cry out saying, you may be fine now, but in 5 generations, vengeance is coming. Be prepared in 5 generations. 5 generations later, a guy named Croesus is the king. And Croesus is living a good life. He's king, he has a powerful kingdom, his family is doing well, and he's telling people that he is the happiest man who has ever lived. What's the story? Pride comes before a fall. He's telling people that he's the happiest man who ever lives. But he doesn't know about this curse. So at some point he has a dream of his son dying. And he tries to protect his son, but ultimately he's unable to. And his son dies. So Croesus goes into this depression and he mourns for 2 years over the death of his son. In the meantime, over in Persia, the Persian king, who was the king of the Medes, had a dream where his daughter had water flowing from her womb and filling all the lands. He interpreted that and felt that it meant that she would have a child whose power would overcome everything in the kingdom. So he determined that instead of marrying her off to other royalty, he would marry her off to someone of much lower rank. He would marry her to a Persian. someone who was looked down on in their society. So he did that. But still, he had another dream that she had vines growing out of her womb, and he felt that there was still a danger. So she got pregnant, and when she gave birth, he had the child taken away. And he gave the child to a servant who was supposed to kill the child. But the servant didn't want to kill the child, so the servant took the child to a herdsman and told the herdsman to take the child off into the wilderness and leave it so the elements or the animals or whatever could kill the child. Now, the herdsman's wife had just lost a baby, so they didn't want to do this. So what they instead did is they took their dead child and left it out in the elements, and they raised the live child, the grandchild of the king, not knowing that it was the grandchild of the king, as their own. They named the child Cyrus. And at the age of 10, Cyrus had convinced all of the other kids that he should be their king. And he was ordering all the other kids around. And when one kid refused to do as he was told, Cyrus had that child whipped for disobeying the king. And this child was of a higher rank. Remember, Cyrus was a Persian. This other child was part of the Medes. So this child went home and told his father, who told the king. And Cyrus was brought before the king to give an account. When he went before the king, he started talking about why he did what he did. And the king notices a resemblance between himself and Cyrus. And he thinks about the age and he figures out what happened. So he calls the herdsman in and puts pressure on him, and the herdsman confesses. So then he brings the loyal servant in and he confesses as well. The servant thinks he's going to be punished, but instead the king throws him a feast. Now, he shows up to the feast, but what he doesn't know is that that night the king had his son killed. And when he shows up at the feast, there's all this food. What he doesn't know is that the food he's eating is his son's body. He doesn't realize it until he gets to the last plate, and he lifts the lid off the last plate, and there is his son's head sitting there, and he realizes what's happening, and he says that he wants revenge. And eventually Cyrus is going to grow up and lead a revolt, and that servant is going to be sort of his right-hand man in the process. Cyrus leads a revolt. The Persians take over, and they replace the Medes as the leaders of the government. Under Cyrus, the Persians start going on all these military expeditions, and they start conquering their neighbors, and they start expanding their kingdom. At this time, having grieved for 2 years over the loss of his son, Croesus starts paying attention, and he hears stories about Cyrus and the Persians taking over, and he becomes worried. Maybe I might be next. Maybe they may come and take over my kingdom. So he comes up with a plan that maybe he needs to go and attack the Persians before they attack him. So he goes to the oracle of Delphi and he asks, should I attack the Persians? And the oracle says, if you attack the Persians, you will bring down a great kingdom. He hears that and interprets it as if he attacks the Persians, he will bring down the Persian kingdom. He didn't think of it that it might be the opposite, that he might bring down his own kingdom. So he starts planning for the attack. He wants to have all of the Greek city-states on his side. So he goes to the Greek city-states and he starts organizing them as allies. And then he goes and he attacks the Persians without the Greek allies helping him out yet. He's by himself at this point. And it's a bloody battle. Major casualties on both sides. But in the end, the Persians win. They defeat Croesus, they pillage his city, and they take him a prisoner. As he's there a prisoner, he thinks back to 2 years before, when he was so prideful, when he called himself the happiest man who lived. And he remembers the words of one of the people who visited him, who responded by saying, "No one, while he lives, is happy." Cyrus comes and meets with Croesus, though, and he asks him, "Why did you attack me?" And Croesus blamed the Greek gods. He said, "The Greek gods told me to do it." Of course, he misunderstood what the Greek gods said through the oracle. He says, "No one is foolish as to prefer war to peace, in which instead of sons burying their fathers, fathers bury their sons. but the gods will it. Again, he's misunderstanding what the gods wanted. It was him who did it, right? But he blames the gods. In the meantime, those Greek city-states who had worked up alliances with Croesus, they suddenly start bringing gifts to the Persians and basically apologizing and say they want peace. But Cyrus feels that it's too late. They have allied with the wrong side, and he will need to take vengeance on them at some point. But first, he decides to go and take Babylon. And he does. He takes the city of Babylon. And then there's a nomadic group run by a woman named Queen Tomiris. And he thinks he can conquer them. But now he's getting a little bit prideful. And pride comes before a fall. And the Persians lose fighting against this queen. And Cyrus is killed in the battle. He's replaced by Cambyses, and then he's replaced by Darius. Darius becomes the king, and someone comes to him and says, "Don't you remember you owe me a favor?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, you helped me out when I was in need. What would you like for me to do?" And they point a certain Greek city-state and say, "Go and conquer them." So Darius does it as a favor. Here we have a war, not for the gods, not even because of personal ambition, but as a favor to someone else. He conquers Thrace, he goes to Macedonia, and he starts closing in on Athens and Sparta. In the meantime, the Ionians go up in revolt, and they get the Athenians to help them in their revolt against the Persians. Darius is very unhappy about this Ionian revolt, and he blames the Athenians for the revolt, and he very publicly vows revenge against Athens, and he plans for war against the Athenians. So he raises up a very large army, and he sends them to go and fight the Athenians. The two armies come together at Marathon. You have the much larger Persian army, but the Athenians out-strategize them, and they win at Marathon. So Darius is really angry now, and he raises up an even larger army, perhaps the largest army in the history up to that point. And they go up against a combined group of Greeks led by the Athenians and the Spartans. And it starts with them defeating a group of 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Maybe you've seen the movie. They continue on. They take Athens, but then they get sucked into a naval battle. The Athenians and the Spartans against the Persians. And the Greeks end up winning at Salamis, defeating the Persian Empire and protecting the Greek way of life. So this is kind of a wild story that Herodotus tells in the Histories. But is it accurate? Is it true? Join us for the next video, and we will talk about how Herodotus found this story. I'm Cody. This is Time for History. I'll see you then.